Hello and welcome to the HistoryNetwork.org podcast. Just a small note about the audio quality here. I am currently convalescing on the south coast of England from breaking my leg on the ski slopes of the French Alps, and as a result, this podcast's audio may not be up to our normal standard. So I do apologise for that in advance, but I don't have all my kit with me, so please bear with it. Season 22, Episode 9, The Bayonet. This episode was prepared by Alan J. Shue, who considers himself a serious student of the changing physical and social environment of the infantry rifleman. When we consider the bayonet of the rifle, its history is the history of all direct combat warfare. In modern times, if you are in personal combat where your last device is your bayonet, it means a lot of things have gone wrong for you to be in that position. Do you have what it takes to survive? The next 2 minutes will tell. Bayonet fighting requires an attitude, physical strength and agility, skill and knowledge beyond that of basic military training. Taking an oath and wearing the uniform may qualify you to be sent to a theatre of war, but do you have the personal attitude to get really close to a man and end his life in the next moment by a very primitive, brutal and bloody method? Not everybody can do that. Whereas pushing a button and a shell is lobbed over a hill does not take much emotional detachment. Almost anyone can be taught to do that in 90 days. The requirements to be a good bayonet aficionado are not the same as for good civilian neighbour requirements. Good neighbours are pleasant, patent, tolerant, helpful, reverent even. But in his military mind, the bayonet fighter survivor's character is hardy, mean, cynical, tough, canny, knowledgeable, and lucky. Looking at a typical group of conscripts, perhaps 1 in 10 can be taught to be a good bayonet fighter. A seasoned pro-drill instructor would spot him in 5 minutes. It is like professional combat experienced pilots looking at a group of young pilot trainees. There will be 1 hawk for every 9 pigeons. They may all get the same training, but they will not all perform the same after the shooting starts. A true experimental scientific evaluation of the bayonet has apparently never been tried. In modern times, especially with the emphasis on measurement of effectiveness, MOE, officers in the war colleges are more likely to consider alternatives. There would be a comparison of the weight of the equipment compared to its perceived utility against an overall weight constraint maximum knapsack solution. The problem is that the measure of effectiveness data are rarely complete and accurate. When it comes to bayonet design, there are hundreds of variations. There does not seem to be scientific data to suggest one design is better than another, or even that one length is better than another. Members of the Bayonet Collectors Society, Society of American Bayonet Collectors, or SABC, recognise 440 examples from 65 countries. It is in this perspective that we will describe the history of the bayonet, how it came about, and how its function relates to the changing environment of the infantryman. There is a lot about the bayonet's origins that we do not know. No one rang a bell or filed a patent and said there was a new and useful device that we will call a bayonet. This presentation will suggest the general origin and describe the changes that have evolved for the basic personal survival knife through its use with a firearm, which made the knife a bayonet, to its most common use today as a multipurpose infantry weapon, tool. The bayonet is defined as a specialised knife of indeterminate length, but probably less than 2 feet total, and of various compositions, usually metal, but now some have plastic components, that attaches to a firearm. The connect-disconnect feature is the distinguishing feature that typically converts a knife or short sword into a bayonet. Some were permanently attached, either straight ahead or folding against the barrel, both in ancient and in modern times. If left in its scabbard on a belt or load-bearing system, it would be considered a survival tool-knife combination. Today, bayonets may have features that include a wire cutter and a bottle opener, see patent US 5594967, and saw blade. The scabbard also may have a sharpening stone or a ceramic honing rod and special method of attaching to a carry harness. The ancient history of personal offensive protective devices such as a personal knife is not well documented. It seems likely that from very early on in human history everyone was armed with something. A short knife would be a likely personal offensive weapon, possession probably for both men and women. There is also the issue of personal protection, defensive against the opponent's sharp knife, as with a shield or personally worn leathers, and eventually metal breastplates. Today's soldier frequently wears flexible body armour that is at least some protection against knives, small caliber pistol fire, flying debris from explosions. An early theme of personal protection was probably the desire to extend reach, a means of extending reach as by attaching the knife to a stick. A person had to have something that outreached the opponent so you could stab him before he stabs you. The pike was such a device, eventually reaching a length to the weight maximum one person could carry. If a group of people in the family or clan formed up, then this led necessarily to drill in tactics of engagement. We can assume tactics were not very sophisticated. This is no cannon or cavalry yet. There are sling and arrow missiles with which one must contend. When an ecological change happens in the environment, the infantry responds. The pike came in handy as the Proto-Indo-Europeans from the steppes between the Black and Caspian Seas domesticated the horse and expanded their influence into the Fertile Crescent. Horses meant cavalry, and the infantry, to oppose them, would need to form the square to keep the horsemen at bay. People did what they had to do, and survivors repeated what worked. Small unit tactics often were effective for thousands of years. If it worked against horsemen, it would also work against Hannibal's elephants. Warfare eventually made use of firearms. Gunpowder meant the infantry had to adapt again. Another ecological change happens in the environment as the perception of the pike changes to a firearm with knife attached as a bayonet, with the incorporation of firearms in infantry equipment. The definition of an infantry since ancient times is the general branch of an army where soldiers in units move and engage in military close-ranged fighting on foot rather than on horses. In modern times, typically the infantry carries rifles with bayonets, but also has grenades, and specialised units have machine guns and mortars as weapons. Throughout history, infantry units bear the largest brunt of warfare and typically suffer the greatest number of casualties during a military campaign. Bayonet is usually defined as a dagger-like steel weapon that is attached to or at the muzzle of a musket barrel and used for stabbing or slashing in hand-to-hand combat. Origin and etymology of the term is French bayonet, from Bayonne, France. The focal point for development of the plug bayonet was the Pyrenees region along the borders of Spain, France and Portugal. There is inadequate documentation of the events in the bayonet's early history. Where and when first employed is not clear. Some sources credit Europe, others Asia. Nobody rang a bell or filed a patent, as we've said before. The The infantry formation here is rows of opposing riflemen with poor accuracy muskets. Typically it is reported that by around 1600 AD, the first models of bayonet as a knife with a quick connect feature were long wood-handled steel blade variations. The blade was about a foot or 30 centimetres long, as was the handle that fitted into the muzzle of the musket's barrel. The soldier would stick the wooden handle in the muzzle of the barrel after taking the last shot before enemy contact at close quarters. Sometimes the bayonet fell out. A better design was needed. Soon, socket bayonets would incorporate both ring mounts and an offset blade, keeping the bayonet away from the muzzle blast of the musket barrel. After the Peace of Ryswick, 1697, the English and Germans abolished the pike and introduced ring bayonets. Pictures of them are on show in Souriri de Saint-Rémy's Mémoires d'Artillerie, published in Paris in that year. In 1703, the French infantry adopted spring-loaded locking systems that prevented the bayonet from accidentally separating from the musket, an obviously needed requirement. Somewhere in here is the idea of a bayonet charge of one infantry unit against another. It was assumed that opposing forces marched in ranks toward each other, as was the custom of the time. Each would stop and fire, reload and take up again the closing march. At some point, say 50 metres apart, it was faster to charge with the bayonet than to reload. The bayonet was used frequently during the Napoleonic Wars, given inadequately trained conscript armies and use of inaccurate smoothbore muskets. Officers might prefer to use the bayonet charge instead of musket volley fire where possible. Antoine-Henri Jomini, a celebrated military author of the Napoleonic period, stated that the majority of bayonet charges in the open resulted with one side fleeing before any contact was made. Upon being overrun, those retreating would assist their own wounded if possible. Those left behind were likely to suffer, always, ultimately, fatal bayonet wounds. With World War I, changes to both sides were immense. There's artillery explosions, machine gun fire, gas, blimps, airplanes, a real mess. A lot of artillery perhaps accounting for 90% of infantry casualties. Prior to World War I, bayonet doctrine was largely founded upon the concept of reach, which was a soldier's theoretical ability by use of a long rifle and fixed bayonet to stab an enemy soldier before the opponent's blade reached him. It was an extension of the idea of the longest pike. The extended thrust and lunge attack tactic started with the soldier dropping into a crouch with the rifle and fixed bayonet held close to the body. In this position, the soldier next propelled his rifle forward and in a series of steps thrust out the right arm full length with the extended rifle held in the grip of the right hand alone. With a maximum reach of about 11 feet, or 335 centimetres, the throw-point bayonet attack gave an impressive reach. Necessary training in the tactics were required. Field manuals such as FM 23-25 and FM 3-25.150 provide documentation. Of course, if both sides study the same tactic, then the other issues such as extent of training, confidence, general health, motivation, leadership and quality of personal body armour become important. Once in the trench there was limited movement for bayonet duels. Once soldiers had been trained to expect throw point or extended thrust and lunge attack, the method lost most of its tactical value on the World War I battlefield. It required a strong arm and wrist, which was very slow to recover if the initial thrust missed its mark, and was easily parried by a soldier who was trained to expect it, thus exposing the soldier to a return thrust which he could not easily block or parry. Another major theme enters the picture here as military authorities desired to use the methodology of science both in development of the equipment and in its evaluation. Military supply authorities want to know if there is a benefit for the equipment to justify its cost. That includes the cost of production and distribution of the weapon. It should be noted that typical measures of effectiveness with an infantry weapon require careful consideration. For example, how effective is the rifle? If an infantry soldier fires the rifle at an enemy combatant, what are the odds he will kill the opponent? The objective answer is very nearly zero, as records show over 100,000 rounds are expended in modern times for every enemy to accomplish the kill. At least that is for US forces. Then we might ask, what are the odds of a kill if the soldier stabs his opponent with a bayonet? Very nearly the answer would be certainly, as the typically stuck soldier has bled out in 2 minutes max. Forensically speaking, the biggest target for bayonets is the chest or abdomen area. A lung and diaphragm wound can cause death due to asphyxiation quicker than loss of blood volume from a major artery being severed. If the severed artery involves the carotids, almost immediate unconsciousness results from the loss of oxygen to the brain. The strategy might be to deliver a chest wound, then cut the carotids. Bayonet wounds tend to be fatal because collapsed lungs and holes in intestines cause the victim to bleed out fast. Statistics of admission rates to field hospitals can be deceiving. Only wounds were recorded in the hospital records. Most men who were injured by bayonet bled out before they got to the hospital. There were few or no records from the 18th and 19th centuries that survived to modern times. Do you count those wounded by ball or explosion but finished off by bayonet? If one counts the number surviving to be treated in hospital, you might guess only a 2% rate. If you count the number wounded by cannon or ball and finished off with a bayonet, you might guess 1 in 3 of fatal wounds from a bayonet. Is it only those wounded that make it to surgery? Of course, bayonet wounds are usually bled out in 2 minutes, so they do not make it to surgery. The number of killed and wounded in the American Civil War is not known precisely. There were spectacular episodes, as when Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain led the bayonet charge down Little Round Top at Gettysburg. All records from the states in rebellion were lost in fire at Richmond. There is a development of other equipment, e.g. firearms, unit and individual tactics, training, that together determine the effectiveness of the specific part that the bayonet will play. Simply put, why would the individual infantry soldier want to bother with carrying one more piece of equipment? This is a rhetorical question, of course, as that is the one piece of equipment he would give up last. By its use when all else fails, if you are the infantryman who has expended grenades and ammunition, and you are down to the bayonet knife, you might have a different opinion than someone back in supply at military headquarters. An unobtrusive measure of bayonet value is if the infantryman chooses to leave it behind. Perhaps half of stuff issued to the soldier gets left behind in the combat area in some situations. Folks leave a lot of issued equipment behind when moving out. It is interesting that probably few would leave behind a bayonet. We have to ask why. Well, would a soldier leave behind a life vest? It has a psychological advantage. You still have one remaining object, means of self-defence, or with which to carry out an attack or defence. To the combat infantry rifleman that needs it, initial cost is not a factor, as he is dealing with a tool that may extend his life. Because of its usefulness in hand-to-hand fighting, no matter how infrequent or impractical, the bayonet remains a valuable part of the infantry soldier's equipment. By World War II, there is another change in that American and British Commonwealth forces were deployed to the far reaches of empire to include direct battle contact with Japanese infantry. Contact between the opposing forces was in a different environment, not the flat lands of the northern Europe, but now also the jungles and swamps of Asia. The environment meant that contact might not have been initially between gunfire, open exchange, but rather first contact between camouflaged troops in jungle, hidden in ambush and within arm's reach. World War II had many different environments and encountered many different enemy tactics. The Marines in jungle warfare might not see the opponent until but a few meters away. Although there are reports of American Marines hating to use their bayonets, it was on occasion necessary, as the mingling of opposing forces meant friendlies were in the line of fire, and so weapons were not discharged. First contact was with the bayonet, and the gunfire only happened if the blade got stuck in the bone and the body was on the ground. Pulling the trigger would free the entanglement of blade and bone. Everyone has seen the newsreel of Japanese banzai charges, an attack by a formation of infantrymen with fixed bayonets, usually over short distances, to overrun enemy strongpoints, capture artillery batteries, or break up enemy troop formations. In some circumstances, the bayonet was useful for dispatching prisoners that fell behind. The Japanese buzzard squads following the column of prisoners during the Bataan Death March is an example. They killed American soldiers by this method over the several days of the march. The number of Philippines prisoners killed were 10 times more. Exact figures are unknown. Accurate records were not kept. The number is estimated by subtraction between number starting and finishing the march. Estimates range from 500 to 650 American deaths during the march. The Bataan Death March was the forcible transfer by the Imperial Japanese Army of Filipino and American prisoners of war from Mariveles, Philippines, April 1942. Japanese troops moving prisoners, such as on the Bataan Death March, would bayonet those falling behind. It was the method of execution choice. One chest stab and the victim was left to bleed out. There was minimum noise and no expenditure of valuable ammunition. The violence of the occasion encouraged others to keep going if at all possible. The march was characterized by severe physical abuse and wanton killings. It was later judged by an Allied military commission to be a Japanese war crime. There is a behavioural issue. Stress of combat and aftermath interviews of Japanese guards after World War II showed reluctance of some of the conscript Japanese infantrymen to stab the American and Filipino prisoners during the death march. From an interview at the end of the war, one guard claimed he first refused until his sergeant said the order was from the Emperor, and if he did not do his duty, he would also be stabbed. He said that night the spirit of the dead man appeared to him. Modern concepts like post-traumatic stress or the psychological impact perceived by military and civilian populations were not generally given great weight. One must also consider the effect on morale of gleaming bayonets advancing steadily on defenders. The British Army Command for fixing bayonets featured a movement where the blade is held overhead for an instant to communicate the threat which it represents. It was especially effective to control civil unrest, dissipating a crowd of rioters without firing a shot. Nothing is more convincing than a police officer in an urban setting during crowd control exhibiting a bayonet on his shotgun. That look and noise means business, which can diffuse the situation and disperse a crowd fast. Combat with bayonets will always occur, but mostly on a small scale when units of opposing sides encounter each other in a confined environment, such as during the storming of fortifications or during skirmishes in broken terrain. Almost all assault rifles produced today still have provision for a bayonet. Today's bayonets are often multi-purpose knives. When we consider the bayonet off the rifle, its history is the history of all direct combat warfare. The bayonet still has a place as the last-ditch weapon of almost all armies of the world. Once again, apologies for the sound quality of this episode, as I'm not in my usual sound-prepared environment with all my audio kit, and I'm not in a particularly soundproof area either, so do excuse the sound of the thrush and starlings, which you may have heard during the recording of this podcast as well. They've been very vocal, singing outside the window near where I'm recording. Not much I can do about that. Anyway, that's all for this week. Join us in a couple of weeks for the last episode of Season 22. Do go to the website www.thehistorynetwork.org and do go to our Facebook page and like us on there and interact with us on there, where you can find out about all the other podcasts we do as well. Thanks again for listening. You've been listening to the HistoryNetwork.org podcast, written by Alan J. Shue, read by Nick Barker.